do this, to view our handout, you can either listen, for those of you who are live in the room, or you can just follow along on the screen. If you'd like to bring up the screen on your phones, that would certainly be an option. And I believe that Elaine had emailed the handout as well. Today, we're going to be, after doing a brief look into the Kuzari and doing an additional paragraph in the Kuzari, we'll talk a little bit about Shavuos and what Matan Torah is all about, or really Kabbalat Torah, accepting the Torah, what it's really all about. We were learning last week, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi has a recurring theme that runs throughout, it's a current that runs throughout Sefer Kuzari, that holiness inheres in people, places, and things, and times, okay? And the place of greatest holiness is in Eretz Yisrael, and particularly when we talk about Zion, we're referring to the city of Jerusalem, and particularly in the city of Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, and particularly on the Temple Mount, the temple, and particularly in the temple, the Holy of Holies, and particularly in the Holy of Holies, that very, very tiny point that is between the two cheruvim, between the two angels, where the divine presence rests. But it emanates from there, and the closer that one finds themselves spatially to that point when the divine presence is resting in the temple, the more that one can become privy to that kind of divine influence, where, in a sense, heaven meets earth, and there is a kind of greater sense of connection. They call it the local phone call versus a long distance call. That's an old time analogy, because today there is no difference now with internet phones. But in any event, that's the sense that you get from Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. And because of that, because of this emphasis on people, places, things, and times, this leads to the Khazar King's sort of challenge, paragraph number 10 in essay number 4. And I'm going to mute everyone just because some people may not be aware that their microphones are on. So you can always unmute yourselves afterwards. Let me just spotlight my screen. So this leads to the next paragraph. The Kuzari said, and here's the Khazar king presenting a challenge to everything that's been set up until now. But there are other religions which arose after you that agree that the Torah is true and do not seek to refute it. This is on page 426 in the Feldheim edition. What religions is Rabbi Yehuda Halevi referring to when he says that these are religions that came up after Judaism? They agree that the Torah is true and do not seek to refute it. So what? Well, Christianity certainly, and Islam, it's complicated, okay? Islam, on the one hand, does question the veracity of Jewish tradition, but on the other hand, it accepts the bulk of the stories and the personalities that appear in the Chumash. Let me just, before I continue, today's shir is dedicated to the memories of Moshe Henech ben David Halevi and Shena Devora bas Moshe Tzvi, by Annette and Usher Britros, and we thank you for your sponsorship of the shir today. So it's, as I was saying, Islam is complicated in its relationship to the book itself, the Bible. It does, in many places, call the Bible a tahrif, which in Arabic means a forgery, or something that's counterfeit. Or I should really say not a forgery. Tahrif is corruption. It is something it's a corrupted text, which means parts of it are true and parts of it are untrue. But at the same time, Islam acknowledges all of the prophets of Israel were authentic prophets. But just that, including, and then as a nod to Christianity, Jesus was also a prophet in their pantheon of prophets. the final and ultimate prophet was the Prophet Muhammad. That's how Islam views its association with Judaism and Christianity, because it comes centuries after the advent of Christianity. Okay? Now, with that in mind, this is what Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is referring to when he says that they agree that the Torah is true to some degree and do not seek to refute it. They too ascribe ascendancy to this place Jerusalem, and say that it is the place where their prophets ascended through the heavenly gates, that it is where divine judgment converges, that souls of the deceased will gather there at the time of the resurrection, and that prophecy abounded among the Jewish people. They have also acknowledged the greatness of your forefathers, the act of creation, the flood, and everything else written in the Torah. They also make festival pilgrimages to this esteemed place. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is giving us a bit of an education about world religion, certainly the Abrahamic religion. So I figured that we should educate ourselves just a little bit, just to get a cursory amount of knowledge. We're not here to do comparative religions, and we're not here to give you an extensive course on Christianity and Islam, but certainly it's worth our while just at least to have some kind of context to understand what Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is talking about. Is let's just learn about just from a Wikipedia entry page on the holiness of Jerusalem in both Christianity and Islam. Yeah. Yeah. Well, take a look. You'll see what he says. And yeah. Yes. Yes. So take what he says with a grain of salt, in the sense that what he's doing, he's setting up a bit of a he's creating a setup to both praise and criticize in the same breath. In other words, these are the words of the Khazar king, who is the innocent convert who looks at the other religions and says, look at how much value they place upon Judaism, the Torah, and your holy places. So what's wrong with subscribing to these religions as much as I subscribe to Judaism? That's essentially the challenge. Remember, these are the words that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi places in the mouth of the Khazar king, who's innocently and genuinely curious as to what's wrong with Christianity and Islam. Okay, so let's first understand what he's saying based on the actual texts over here. So I don't know, unfortunately, our projector's not working today, but Elaine sent out the handout in an email if you want to bring that up on your phone, or if you want to be able to go to the Zoom link that we send out in the WhatsApp every week. Of course. Does that make you feel better? Oh, absolutely. Okay, for sure. Well, it's only semi-dark. Okay. Yeah, okay, there you go. Okay, so this is just purely out of Wikipedia. In Christian faith, Jerusalem's place in the life of Jesus gives it great importance, in addition to its place in the Old Testament. Now, this may be the reason why you may have seen, when you were in Yerushalayim, many, many missions of evangelical and other groups of Christians going to Jerusalem, going to the Via Dolorosa, going to the holy places, going to the Kinneret, to the what do they call it? What do they call the Kinneret? The Sea of Galilee. Thank you, and other holy places, the Jordan River, right, and so forth, where Jesus was allegedly baptized, and so forth, and other of their holy people. Jerusalem is the place where Jesus was brought as a child to be presented at the temple, as it is written in the book of Luke, and to attend festivals. According to the Gospels, Jesus preached and healed in Jerusalem, especially in the temple courts. There is also an account of Jesus's cleansing of the temple, chasing various traders out of the sacred precincts in the book of Mark. At the end of each of the Gospels, there are accounts of Jesus's Last Supper in an upper room in Jerusalem, his arrest in Gethsemane, which is near the Mount of Olives, his trial, his crucifixion at Golgotha, his burial nearby, and his resurrection and ascension. Jerusalem is generally considered the cradle of Christianity. The earliest Christians were outcast and used the ichthys fish symbol as a way to know if someone was Christian, sort of like they used that as a code symbol. This would prevent prosecution or death from the Romans. Christianity became more popular over time, but made a huge expansion when the Roman Emperor Constantine claimed Christianity as his religion and thus the religion of the Roman Empire. Jerusalem is mostly important to Christianity because it is where Jesus was brought occasionally as a child, preached to the poor in his adult life, crucified at the end of his life, and resurrected by God. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which many of you know is in the Old City, is said to have been built over the location where Jesus was crucified and where the tomb was buried. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is generally considered the most important church in Christendom. Okay, what about the Vatican? How does that compare? We're going to see Rabbi Yehuda Halevi respond to this. In Christianity, the Jewish connection with the city is considered as the account of God's relationship with his chosen people, the original covenant, and the essential prelude to the events narrated in the New Testament, including both universal commandments, such as the Ten Commandments, and obsolete or Judaism-specific ones. Okay? In medieval times, Christians thought Jerusalem was the center of the world. So you may have seen maps in medieval times of where Jerusalem is the center and all of the other hemispheres and different parts of the civilized world branch out from that. Umbilicus mundi or axis mundi, and was so represented in the so-called T&O maps. Byzantine hymns speak of the cross being planted in the center of the earth, and the imagery is tied to the concept of the death and resurrection of Jesus being for the benefit of all mankind. Medieval maps of Europe usually place the East Jerusalem at the top, and this arrangement led to the use of the term to orient, which means to align a map with actual compass directions. So you never knew that, right? You have to get oriented. It comes from the word orient, which means the East, because they always used to put Jerusalem on the top, which was the East. Isn't that interesting? Okay, so that's Adkan, the association of Christianity to Jerusalem. In this entry, most of the discussion is based on the present, that Jesus called Jerusalem to a certain degree his home, and therefore, but from what the Khazar King is suggesting, is that it also has significance, like in this last paragraph that we read, it is considered to be a holy place because of God's connection to the Jewish people. You can turn it off before you come to. Yeah, thank you. Okay, that's okay. 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 All right. Next. Now let's talk about Islam. Okay. In Sunni Islam, Jerusalem is the third holiest city after Mecca and Medina. Muslims believe that Muhammad was transported to Jerusalem during his night journey. The Quran describes how the Prophet was taken by the miraculous steed Burak from the great mosque of Mecca to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the farthest place of prayer, where he prayed, and then to visit heaven in a single night in the year 621 of the Common Era. And he quotes from the Quran to indicate that. And then he says in Surah 17, although the city of Jerusalem is not mentioned by any of its names in the Quran, a lot of people are not aware of that, but the city of Jerusalem is not mentioned once in the Quran, but it is mentioned in later Islamic literature as the place of Muhammad's night journey. The story of Muhammad's ascension from Al-Aqsa Mosque was understood as relating to the temple in Jerusalem, referred to as Bait al-Maqdis, the Beit HaMikdash. The Al-Aqsa Mosque is specified of being in Jerusalem in numerous hadith prophetic traditions. The hadith is books that were written after the composition of the Quran. Okay. Zayn ibn Tabit reports that the Prophet said, "How blessed is Asham." The companions around asked, "Why is that?" The messenger replied, "I see the angels of Allah spread their wings over Asham." And Asham is one of the terms for the general Middle Eastern region. Ibn Abbas added, "And the prophets lived in it. There is not a single inch in Al-Quds, Jerusalem, where a prophet has not prayed or an angel not stood." The spiritual importance of Jerusalem in Islam is further emphasized due to its status as the first Qibla. What does the word Qibla mean? The direction of prayer. Okay, Islamic tradition holds that Muhammad led prayers towards Jerusalem until the 16th or 17th month after his migration from Mecca to Medina, when Allah directed him to instead turn towards the Kaaba in Mecca. The Kaaba is that big black cube, which originally, according to Islamic tradition, was used by pagans as a place of idolatry, and then converted into a holy place where Muhammad designated it as a place of monotheistic worship. And that's why there's a commandment for Muslims to make a Hajj or a pilgrimage at least once in their lives to go to Mecca and to make a hakafa, to make a circuit around the Kaaba, that big black cube. Another part, but originally that was not the case. Originally the Kaaba, or the cube, was an idolatrous icon. It was only later, and so during that early period, Muhammad said we should all pray towards Jerusalem. Another part of Jerusalem's significance and holiness to Muslims derives from its strong association with Abraham, David, Solomon, and Jesus. They are all regarded as prophets of Islam, and their stories are mentioned in the Quran. Today, the Temple Mount is dominated by three monumental structures from the early Umayyad period, which was one of the caliphates in Islam. These were, and the structures that currently occupy the Temple Mount are all Muslim construction. The Dome of the Rock, the Dome of the Chain, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The Dome of the Rock was first constructed in 691. Dome of the Chain, also 691, 692. And the Al-Aqsa Mosque, 705 to 715 of the Common Era. Okay, so now this is just basic stuff. In other words, there's nothing, we're not going into any depth, but I just thought that this was just something to touch upon if we're learning that that from the Khazar king, that the other major faiths, the Abrahamic faiths, all place an emphasis and a priority on the city of Jerusalem. So what makes the Jewish view special about the importance of the city of Jerusalem? So here's the response of the Khazar king. His response is, the rabbi said, "I would have compared these other religions to people who accept only the general principles of the Torah commandments, but not the details." In other words, that's, if I wanted to be generous and I wanted to basically say that Christianity and Islam have legitimacy, there is a place for them in that they acknowledge the truth of the Torah. They acknowledge the basic framework of what the God's direction to the Jewish people was, and they acknowledge the truths of the Torah, perhaps more in a general way instead of the specific way. But were it not for the fact that their actions contradict their doctrine. Listen to what he says. In other words, he says, but there's a certain hypocrisy there. If doctrinally, if your ideology or theology tells you that Jerusalem is important and the Torah is important, then that's one thing. But what would we say when your doctrine is contradicted by your behavior? And that's the criticism that the rabbi offers as a response to the Khazar king's statement. Their reverence of the place of prophecy is in word alone. They instead converge on whatever places they happen to be living, which were previously places of idolatry, and where no divine manifestation was ever witnessed. And this is in reference to both Christianity, where emphasis is placed on Rome, and a reference to Islam, where emphasis is placed on Mecca. He says, it's if you look at the cradle of prophecy and the cradle of the origins of your faith to be Jerusalem, and you say, oh, it's so holy and it's so special, why then is so much more emphasis in your faith placed on Rome and Mecca? That's Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's argument. He says the proof is in the pudding, right? They have retained the same religious practices as the idolatrous ones before them, as well as their sacrificial days and holy days. In other words, both Christianity, which was adopted by Constantine in the Roman Empire, basically took many of the pagan practices of the Romans and incorporated that into Christianity. And Islam took many of the pagan practices that were extant in the Arab Peninsula before the advent of Islam and incorporated that into the Islamic faith. He says they have changed only the idolatrous images in these places. They smashed the idols, but they did not smash the religion. Because you've taken parts of the pagan history and the pagan religious practices and sort of purified them in your monotheistic faith. And that Rebbe Yehuda Halevi says, I'm critical of. Judaism, we never did that. And again, I'm not here to either defend his proofs historically or to disprove what Rebbe Yehuda Halevi is suggesting, but he's saying this is one of the distinctions between Judaism on the one side and Christianity and Islam on the other side. When we became a new people and we accepted the Torah, there was no vestige, there was no remnant of any idolatrous practice that we kept in Judaism. If anything, we distanced ourselves from idolatrous practices. One example of that would be the matzeva. In other words, earlier in the Torah, the matzeva, the monolithic altar that we find that Yaakov, for example, sets up in the book of Genesis and Bereshis, disappears. And the Torah says, V'lo takim lecha matzeva asher saneh Hashem Elokecha. You may not allow yourself to build a matzeva, a monolithic altar, anymore, because this is something that pagans do. So if anything, we see that HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells us, don't do anything that has a semblance to pagan worship, even if you wish to do it as part of Judaism, even if you wish to purify that practice. And that's another, again, God also in the Torah bans the building or planting of an Asherah tree, right? Let's say we wanted to build a special tree around the temple or a special orchard of trees around the temple because we feel that's a beautification of the temple. But God says, no, if you deify or you assign any kind of holiness to trees, then you're imitating the Asherah practice, and that you cannot do. So it's more complicated than what Rebbe Yehuda Halevi is suggesting, but let's at least appreciate the contrast that he is constructing over here, and that whereas the origins of the other faiths and their religious practices, for example, in Christianity, many suggest that Christmas is a throwback to a Festivus or some other kind of pagan holiday that used to exist in Roman times. And there may be some vestiges, like let's say, for example, Rome is the capital of certainly Roman Catholicism, because of the fact that that's where the Roman Empire had its capital. There's no inherent holiness in Rome. The same could be argued about the city of Mecca. There's nothing inherently holy about it. There's no claim of prophecy of any of the earlier prophets. Perhaps Muhammad prophesied there, but there's no claim of prophecy of any historical events taking there before the advent of Muhammad. Yeah.
It's not intended as what was of some sort, but a necklace with a
Well, there are limitations on making graven images, and even when they're not designated as idolatry, there are certain limitations that are brought down in the Shulchan Aruch. Now, if it's clearly not meant as idolatry, a lot of poskim are very lenient. That's why children are allowed to have dolls, because you're not making it as a graven image, right? My kids, my daughter had dolls when she was little, and my grandkids have dolls. So we allow them when it's clearly not meant as an idolatry. But if there's any religious significance to it, if you want to make a painting of the prophets and things like that and hang them around the shul, then you're not supposed to do that. You're not allowed to do that. I would almost like to say that the reason God states in the verse, and here he has a very interesting parshanut over here, is a very interesting interpretation. He says that there is a passage in the book of Devarim where it says, V'avadet Hashem Elohim acherim eitz va'aven, that it says, you shall worship in the diaspora other gods made of wood and stone. And then repeats that verse later on and says again, Elohim acherim eitz va'aven, in the Tochacha, in Parshas Ki Chavo. So what is the purpose of that? Why does the Torah repeat the words eitz va'aven, made out of stone and made out of wood and made out of stone? It is to allude to these people, those that glorify wood and those that glorify stone. And what is he referring to? Who glorifies wood and who glorifies stone? No, the Christians glorify wood. They glorify the wood of the crucifix. And Muslims glorify the stone of the Kaaba, stone structure that's made out of black stone. Maybe it's painted black, I'm not sure, black marble. And so it's the stone of the Kaaba that is a black stone that is glorified. And what he's suggesting is the reason why the Torah says eitz va'aven is that the Torah is prophesying about Christianity and Islam, that you will be exiled to those lands and you will become part of those other nations and will glorify those things that they glorify. Because of our long stay in these lands, we in our sinful ways have imitated them. We have done the same thing, and we have deified or attached religious significance to things that really do not have religious significance. And this is where we got into our discussion last week about a lot of superstitious activity within Judaism. But I think we're going to hold it here for today in the Kuzari. We've seen that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi does, even though this is not the main thrust of the Sefer, he does on occasion revisit this polemic against Judaism and Christianity, with which he had against Christianity and Islam, with which he had started the Sefer. He doesn't really make mention of it a lot throughout the book, but this is one of those places where he does revisit his criticism of Christianity and Islam as being even, and here really what it is that it's not only that it's doctrinally problematic, because it doesn't have the same rigor as Judaism does, but he says, practically speaking, even the doctrines of Christianity and Islam are not adhered to, certainly not when it comes to the central role that Jerusalem plays. And it seems like in current events and in world history, when it's advantageous for a religion to emphasize the importance of Jerusalem, they do. But in practice, you don't really find too many Muslims making pilgrimages to Jerusalem, right? And as a matter of fact, there are many accounts of how the Temple Mount is used as a place to play soccer on by Muslims, and not so much a place of worship. Yeah.
So he focuses mainly on Jerusalem, and so he has a valid point, but it's not really the primary point, because the primary point is, I would think that you have Judaism, and then the other religions are basically changing it, they're adding on to it, and they're sort of saying that Judaism, according to what they are now adding on and what they believe, that's irrelevant. So I mean, to me, that's more of a major issue, that they've actually changed. Like, it's not just that they don't focus on Jerusalem, that's like just one point, but they've completely changed with Judaism. They've added on so many things that Judaism doesn't believe in. Like, so where does it come from? Why? How? Why should you change? And he doesn't really seem to address that.
But That's not the main focus in this section of the book. Here, we're at a point where the Khazar king has already chosen Judaism as his faith. He's just questioning your focus on the sanctity of Jerusalem seems to be pretty universal. What makes Judaism special in its focus on Jerusalem? And the answer is that despite the rhetoric that we sometimes hear coming from other religions about the importance of Jerusalem in their faith, it's not as they don't hold it as important as they say it is. Yeah.
Also, I always heard Rabbi Barrow say, "Don't judge Judaism by Jews. Don't judge religion by what its adherents do, because that's not fair, really." So you could say the same thing about, this, that if you want to say that the Quran or the New Testament is not valid, that's one thing. But to say, well, why don't its adherents do this, or why don't its adherents do that, that doesn't always hold water.
Yeah, it doesn't always hold water. I think your point is well taken. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi himself admits that Jews do not always live up to their emphasis on Zion. If you remember, not long ago, I was back in essay number 2, where the Khazar king says, you have all of this emphasis on the holiness of Eretz Yisrael, and yet I don't see you making such supreme efforts to try and get there. So what was Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's response? Hovashtani melech kozar, you have shamed me with your true pronouncement about our condition. We talk the talk, but we don't always walk the walk. And that is true. I think, however, that what his point is not so much that Christians and Muslims don't hold high in regard the importance of Jerusalem, but that they've sort of replaced the importance of Jerusalem with their own holy places that are completely separate from Jerusalem, even in their own doctrines. In other words, they place greater importance on Rome over Jerusalem or Mecca over Jerusalem, even though there's no historical precedent, there's no reason to replace Jerusalem because nothing really happened in Rome of great spiritual importance. And the same thing could be argued in Mecca, although I'm not as well versed on the history of Mecca and what purportedly took place there.
So why is it so important for them not to allow us to go out to Har Bayit now?
I mean, it's a question of control. It's a question of who's going to maintain control over that holy place.
If they don't care so much about it, what do they care if we go up?
If they want us to have it.
I know that. So this Moshe Dayan.
Okay, so this is a good place for us to hold it for today. And what we're going to do now is we're going to let's bring up the next. No, because we don't have the. Thank you anyway, but we don't have the projector working. So yeah, and we wish Tzeitchem l'shalom to Rachel. Okay, I'd like to share with you a little piece from Reb Tzadok Cohen Milublin, who asks a very interesting question. We're going to be celebrating Shavuos, and we know that Shavuos is the time of Zman Matan Torasenu. It's the time of the giving of our Torah. But the fact is that when you think about it, what really happened on Shavuos and what was the aftermath of Shavuos? We didn't get the tablets on Shavuos. We heard the 10 commandments. Moshe came down with the tablets on the 17th of Tammuz, and then, which was 40 days later, and then broke the tablets. And it wasn't really until Yom Kippur that we received the second set of tablets, and we really finally received, in a sense, the Torah to be a permanent part of our treasure, to be part of our national possession. And this is really what he's going to be asking over here, and he'll explain to us why Shavuos is so important, despite the fact that it didn't really have any lasting power, and that there was a lot of a lot of tragedy and turmoil that ensued as a result of Shavuos. He says, "Uve'emet anu osim Shavuot v'omrim zman matan Toratenu, af sha'az nitnu rak luchot rishonot shenishberu achar kach." He says, when you think about it, the result of Shavuos was receiving the first tablets, and they were immediately broken. V'ita mutav shetadun kipenuya, v'nireh shebishvirat haluchot nitbatel kol hachitun. And the Medrash says, why did Moshe break the tablets? The Medrash says that Moshe's thinking was, the tablets represent the wedding contract between God and the Jewish people. Better that I should tear up, so to speak, the wedding contract. So if the Jews have been unfaithful to God, they'll be judged as a girlfriend instead of a wife. Okay, in other words, it's one thing if your girlfriend betrays you, it's another thing if your wife betrays you. So therefore, it seems like from this Medrash that the breaking of the tablets was basically God saying, you and I, we're not an item anymore. And so why not make the time when we really became a permanent item, that should be the time of Zman Matan Torah Sein. Umitam ze dorshu b'mishneh, Yom Chatunato ze Matan Torah al Yom HaKippurim, Yom Shenitnu bo Luchot Achronot. He says, and that's why the Mishnah at the end of Maseches Tainis says that the reason why young ladies would go put on white dresses and dance in the vineyard to attract the shidduch on Yom Kippur, they would say this verse from Shir HaShirim, that Yom Kippur is the day of Yom Chatunato, the day of the wedding of God and Israel. Not Shavuos, but Yom Kippur, because that's the day when we receive the second set of tablets. So why do you think it is, he says, that why shouldn't we celebrate Yom Kippur as the day of Matan Torah and not Shavuos? This is his question. V'lamu anu korin Shavuot zman Matan Toratein. Why then is Shavuos called the day of the giving of our Torah? So he says, Ach be'emet nishtabru rak haluchot. He says, but when you think about it on a deeper level, the only thing that was really broken were the tablets. Hainu ma dichtiv charut al haluchot shenechkak al luach libam hadivrei Torah. He says, because there was a permanent result that happened on the day that we stood at Sinai and we heard the voice of God, that it was engraved on our hearts, the words of the Ten Commandments, even if they weren't engraved on the tablets permanently. V'ne'ekar yetzer hara milev kesil mikol vakol, and that there was some kind of eradication from within the hearts of every Jew who stood there, some aspect of the evil inclination. In other words, we were permanently sort of irradiated with divinity that caused an aspect of evil to be removed from us. V'lachein darshu al tikri charut ele cherut, hainu cherut mi malach hamaves, v'hu malach hamavet v'hu yetzer hara. He says, and that's why our sages tell us that when the Torah says that God gave Moshe a set of tablets that was charut, that had engraved on it the commandments, do not read it as charut, as engraved, but rather cherut, that we achieved a sort of a liberty, an independence from the evil inclination on the day when we heard God's voice. Shekeven shenechkak hadivrei Torah aluach libam, hayu kavar cherut miyetzer hara umalach hamaves v'shibud malchuyot. We felt that sense of independence from the evil inclination, from the angel of death, and from being subjugated to political authorities. In other words, the zen nishbar achar kilkul. He says, while it's true that certain aspects of our independence were broken when the tablets were broken, but aval hamatan Torah nishar kavua. But the thing that remained even after the tablets broke was the embedding of the words of Torah into our hearts. In other words, the way that Reb Tzadok looks at it is that the tablets were merely a physical manifestation of an engraving that took place within the hearts and minds of each and every Jew on Shavuos. So whether or not we actually had physical tablets, there was a permanent engraving of the Torah into every single Jew's mind, body, soul, however you want to describe it. And therefore, Shebiyad Yisrael lizkot laor ma'amar anochi sheyitka Talmud Torah belibom v'leor ma'amar lo yilacha sheye'aker yetzahara kamo b'matan Torah. That every Jew acquired a permanent state of the first two commandments. I am the Lord your God, which is really a representation of every single positive commandment. And so therefore it's possible for every Jew to have this entree to a positive growth of study of Torah and the fulfillment of its commandments. And conversely, the second commandment of you shall not have any foreign gods before me is the ability for every Jew to now permanently sort of uproot the evil inclination. V'chol ha-taryag mitzvot nikru b'zohar, taryag zina ita shehem etzot lizkot lo'or ma'amar anochi Hashem Elokecha sheyair b'leiv sheyesh borei olam. He says, and that's why the Zohar calls each one of the 613 mitzvos sort of devices, or I would say devices to help further embed the light of I am the Lord your God within us. And the truth is that in the future, the closer we get to Mashiach, the more that every Jew will feel that they have a portion of this kind of divine light that manifested at the time of Matan Torah. And therefore, every Jew feels that when they observe Shabbos today. Al Yedei Shmirat Shabbat Nigal Mikol Vachol V'Naseh Cherut MiYetzer Hara UMiMalach HaMavet V'Shibud. Jews who really truly observe the Shabbat can feel a semblance of this sense of independence from the evil inclination and from the angel of death and from any kind of subjugation to external authorities and pressures. Rak Yom HaKippurim Nikra Yom Chatunato. He says the difference, therefore, between Shavuos and Yom Kippur is Yom Kippur is the day when there was a permanent change to the psyche, the mindset, the spiritual makeup of every single Jew. And Yom Kippur is called the day of the wedding, which means Sha'az Nitain Torah Sheba'al Peh Harov Chochma L'Takein Harov Kaas. He says because Yom Kippur represents not only the bringing down of the second set of tablets, but also the incorporation not only of the written Torah, but also the oral Torah as well. And a lot of commentaries deal with this discussion of how Yom Kippur, or the second set of tablets, really incorporated an oral tradition as well. Kemosha Amru V'lochot Shniyim Ani Noten Lacha Shiyeh Bahen Midrash Halachot Va'agadot. He quotes the Gemara, or rather a Medrash, to support this, that with the advent of the second tablets came a set of hermeneutic principles through which the Jewish people could interpret different halachot that are part of our oral tradition. Aval ikar zman matan Torah shezachu Yisrael sheyu reuyim sheyair ma'amar anochi b'libam v'ye'aker yetzahara milibam hu b'shavuot. But what is the main time when that transformation of the Jewish essence changed? Our essence changed on Shavuos. That when every Jew fundamentally transformed into a human being that would have the ability to always find God and to eradicate evil from their hearts. So that's the significance of Shavuos. Despite the fact that some very negative things happened afterwards, the transformation of the Jewish people into an enlightened form of humanity permanently took place on Shavuos. This clearly is taking a very Halevian approach, because Reb Tzadok is a Kabbalist, he's a Mekubal, and he takes the Halevian school approach that there was a fundamental transformation that occurred to the Jewish people. at Ma'amad Har Sinai, and that sort of creates a permanent change in every single Jew who's born from that day forward. Yes, Linda.
Second of which you don't accept.
Foreign gods, yeah. And then they built a golden calf.
Say that.
Yeah. So if you remember, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi had devoted, the first essay, a big chunk of the first essay, to trying to explain what the golden calf was and what it wasn't. And his conclusion was that it wasn't really a rejection of God at all, the golden calf, but it was rather the Jewish people not being fully able to let go of the old ways, like we talked about before, and trying to serve God through physical representation. But the golden calf in their minds was a way of approaching God. It wasn't a way of serving other gods. Yeah, right. Yeah. Okay. Now, the only other thing that I wanted to add was that the Sfas Emes does point out to us that we shouldn't completely minimize the significance of the tablets. Tablets themselves, even though they're just a physical representation of what has changed within the Jewish psyche, he says he has an interesting idea to explain the difference between the first tablets and the second tablets. We know that the Inyan Luchot HaAchronot Shehayu Ma'aseh Moshe U'Michtav Elokim. The second tablets was by divine finger. In other words, God inscribed according to our tradition, God inscribed, and what the Torah says, God inscribed the words on the tablets, and Moshe hewed the stone, took it from atop the mountain. But the first set of tablets was completely manufactured by God, both the writing and the stones. As it says in the first set of tablets, that the luchot themselves were made by God. And that's an important distinction. And he says that actually also is representative of a change that occurred within the Jewish people before and after the golden calf. Because when the Jews first received the Torah, their bodies were elevated, not just their souls. And that's why they gained an independence from the angel of death when they first received the Torah on Shavuos. K'moshe kasuv amarti Elokim atem uvnei elyon kulachem. As the psalmist says, that God said when we first accepted the Torah that we were like bnei elyon, we were like angels, destined to live immortally. Perish afilu haguf, even our bodies. V'ita v'anochi amaditi bahar kayamim harishonim. Ma harishonim beratzon, af ha'acharonim beratzon. And Moshe says in Sefer Devarim, when he recalls the events that happened at Har Sinai, and he had to go and get a reprieve for us after the sin of the golden calf, he says, I stood at the mountain after the golden calf, just like I had stood originally there. And our sages say, biratzon, maha rishonim biratzon, just like the first time it was done with desire, both on the behalf of the Jewish people and of God, so too, the second time, the Jewish people and God reconciled. The remez elu haritzanot k'moshe kosafti le'el b'parshas Dvarim al pi hamedrash yafa'at rayati ketirtza kesha'ani mitratze lachem kesha'atem mitratzin li. That God basically is a reactive God, and he basically says to the Jewish people, when you are reconciled to come back to me, then I'm reconciled to come back to you. Uveratzon harishon haya kamoshe kasuv mashcheni acharecha narutza v'yatzu legamri min hateva liot nimshach achar ritzon yitbarach shemo. So when the Jews first said Naasav and Ishma on Shavuos, there was a complete nullification of self-interest on behalf of the Jewish people. They completely committed themselves to Hashem and really completely submitted themselves to his ratzon, to Hashem's will. Ulefi shenit kashru ubo bibrit im HaKadosh Baruch Hu lachein gam achar kach kiviyachol tzimtzem HaKadosh Baruch Hu atzmo liot shochein b'tocham Gam biyotam beguf hagashmi. And because of that original commitment that the Jews made at Har Sinai the first time, Hashem basically said, okay, with the second set of tablets, there's been a reduction. You can no longer be immortal. There can no longer be a transformation of your physical aspect. Just like the second set of tablets is man-made, so too the Jews' human bodies were now going to be confined to nature. But Hashem said, nonetheless, because you've committed yourself to me permanently, I will commit myself to you and dwell in your midst, even though the physical nature of the Jewish people was now reduced. And so in a sense, what the Sfas Emes is indicating is that as a result of the golden calf sin, it was even a greater miracle for God to rest his divine presence among the Jewish people. It's one thing to rest your divine presence among a people who are elevated and exalted and have succeeded in transforming themselves even on a physical plane to live immortally like angels. For God to rest his presence within that kind of population is, so to speak, easier. But now that as a result of the golden calf and the receipt of the second tablets, Hashem still commits himself to the Bnei Israel, that's an even greater miracle for God to rest his infinite divinity within a completely mundane, normal, physical existence of the Jewish nation. And I think what I wanted to bring out from this Sfas Emes commentary is as sort of like a supplement to what Reb Tzadok was suggesting. That on the one hand, yes, the tablets don't represent that sense of permanence, because when we received the Torah at Har Sinai, there was a great catastrophe that resulted afterwards. We sinned, we failed, the tablets were broken, we had to go through a whole new process, which only completed and came to culmination on Yom Kippur that followed. But at the same time, as Reb Tzadok says, there was that permanent bond that was created, the permanent engraving of the Torah onto the hearts of Bnei Israel that happened on Shavuos, even though the Chatunah, sort of the actual wedding and the complete enmeshing of Bnei Israel and God only took place on Yom Kippur. But according to the Sfas Emes, the commitment never waned. Even though the tablets were broken, the commitment that was created between God and Israel, even though perhaps there was no formal wedding taking place on Shavuos in this sense, but the commitment to each other never went away. And as a result of it never going away, even when the Jewish people reduced themselves, so to speak, God still committed himself to them. It's almost as if we could offer the following, perhaps, analogy. The idea that the Sfas Emes is adding is that, let's say you fall in love with a beautiful woman and you commit to each other to get married. And then she gets into an accident and she develops a disfigurement. And you say, you're still the woman that I fell in love with, and we're going to be together forever. That's the way that the Sfas Emes is characterizing what happened on Shavuos and the aftermath. So it's that the commitment that took place on Shavuos with the beautiful Bnei Israel, even though they became somewhat disfigured as a result of the golden calf in a permanent way, nevertheless, Hashem's commitment to us never waned. And it's true, perhaps, that the falling in love stage and the commitment to each other needed to occur before the sin took place. But it's that moment of commitment to each other that we're commemorating on Shavuos. Okay, so what happened to the shattered pieces of the tablets? That's a good question. Debbie asks on the chat. The Gemara says that the shivrei luchot, that the broken pieces of the luchot were placed in the ark. And you learn a very valuable lesson that the second tablets were placed in the ark and the broken pieces of the first luchot were also placed in the ark. And what you learn from there is that sometimes, even though things can be broken, there's a holiness that inheres in even broken pieces. And the same thing is true even in broken people. When people get broken, when people get damaged, one has to still respect that they used to represent something intact and something truly great. And perhaps that's also ties into our discussion, is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu treasures those shivrei luchot, those broken tablets, as much as he treasures the second set of tablets. They needed to be refashioned because the nature of the Jewish people changed. But at the same time, whenever Hashem looks at those shivrei luchot, at those broken tablets, he remembers what made him commit himself to us in the first place. So that's what Shavuos is all about. It's that initial commitment that creates a permanent change within the Jewish people, creates a permanent bond between God and Israel. And even though perforce the nature or the final union between God and Israel looks different and only manifests on a later date, on Yom Kippur, what we celebrate on Shavuot is that initial bond and commitment and transformation. Yes.
I'm gonna go to the court and end the time for sure.
Let me just wish everyone a Chag Sameach because we're at the end of our time. So Chag Sameach, everyone, and then we'll talk in just a moment. Thank you.